Good morning. Let's give an awesome welcome to Daniel Sheehan. And you all know that, how many have already seen him? Okay, so a lot of you know he loves to weave his intro in, and it's just such an honor to have his brilliance, his incredible mind, his passion, and coming from the place of being a congressional public interest lawyer, public speaker, and yet also having his experience with UFOs and this whole realm. Let's give a warm, loving welcome for this awesome Monday conference. Daniel Sheehan, thank you.
Thank you. I've got all right. Well, thank you very much. Fortunately, many of you have heard a lot of the stuff, so we don't have to kind of re-plow some of it. What I want to do is I want to set the context here for our intensive by just again touching on a few of the things. You remember now that back in March of 2009 is when the United States put up the new Kepler planet hunter telescope. We'd had the Hubble telescope up for some time, and it was doing these absolutely remarkable things of photographing distant galaxies, and it was really quite astonishing that the entire scientific community, which is governed, as we've touched upon in some of our earlier gatherings this week, that is dominated by the fourth paradigm scientific, logical, positivist worldview, which we'll be talking about here today, among the others, that they kept on, when they were being asked, like, how many star systems do you believe there are in the Milky Way galaxy? They would say, like 100 billion, kind of like a round number. It's like, easy to dance to. And so that they would say that. And that's only because prior to the Hubble having gone up, that was as many as they could estimate based on how many they could see. And then they were astonished by directing the Hubble into an area that was completely dark and that they'd never been able to see anything in, and they discovered tens of thousands of more galaxies. And every time they did that with the Hubble, in any direction, they discovered tens of thousands of more galaxies. So the figure went up within the scientific community from 100 billion to 200 billion. And then as the Hubble kept on doing its work, they raised that from 200 to 400 billion. And now they're up in the area of 500 billion star systems just in our Milky Way galaxy. And then when the Kepler went up in March of 2009, they began to discover an extraordinary increase in the number of star systems and galaxies. Here's, in case they want to get any of the books or anything. It's right out in front of the door. Thank you. This is Christy, who is our major person inside our office at the Romero Institute dealing with this issue of the extraterrestrial intelligence and the UFO phenomenon, et cetera. So you'll be seeing her today. The bottom line is that what we now know is that there are more probably than 500 billion star systems in our galaxy, and that there are projections now. Some of the lowest ones is that there are 10 trillion galaxies, and so the scientific community, the human scientific community, sort of began to amend its position of suggesting that there's no other planets to begin with. That since they didn't know, they hadn't seen any other planets, they took the position pursuant to the fourth paradigm scientific, logical, positivist worldview that as far as they were concerned, there are no additional planets outside our solar system. And then they started acknowledging, once they were able to discern through the Hubble and then later the Kepler, they were able to pick up these blips going past the star there was a dip in the amount of light coming from the star, and they became convinced that it was planets going past between the telescope and the star. And now that they've got a new Webb telescope that is going to be going up in 2018, which is going to be able to actually see the planets. That with the assistance of a ground telescope, they have a new filter in the telescope that is able to filter out the brilliant light of the star itself, and thereby make it possible to see the planets and to digitize the photographs of them, because they can hold the telescope, the space-bound telescope, in one place, that it doesn't have to be on the Earth, so that the Earth is turning constantly in order to focus on an area to draw in as much light as possible into the mirrors. They used to have to set up this complex clock on the telescope to be able to be constantly turning to stay on the star as the planet moved out from under the telescope. But now, with being able to place the telescope in a stationary orbit around the Earth, which they can move around, they can actually focus on one spot and leave it there for a week or a month to gather in the weakest conceivable light rays, and then through the computers condense them and project them out into photographs. So that event of actually putting up the Kepler telescope on March 7th of 2009 is what really triggered the decision that was made by the Pontifical Academy of Science, the Jesuits that run that, decided that they were going to convene a gathering of scientists in the world in Rome at Castel Gandolfo, which is where the observatory, the Vatican Observatory is. And they gathered them together to start to discuss this probability of being able to actually encounter life on these planets, now that they were willing to acknowledge that other planets existed. And after that 5-day conference that went on in November of 2009, they held a press conference at the Vatican, and I want to read to you just an interesting kind of introduction to what we're dealing with here. It says that between November 6th and November 10th of 2009, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences of the Roman Catholic Church, chaired by Catholic Bishop Marcello Sanchez Sorboto, convened a 5-day scientific conference at Castel Gandolfo, the summer residence of the Catholic Pope, located just outside of Rome, on the grounds of which is located the Pontifical Astronomical Observatory, at which the Vatican brought together some of the leading scientific minds of our planet to discuss with Catholic officials the now growing scientific likelihood of the upcoming discovery of the existence of some other non-human form of intelligent life elsewhere in our galaxy, and to explore the philosophical and theological implications of such a discovery, and our now growing anticipated eventual direct human contact with such an extraterrestrial intelligent civilization. As we discussed earlier, the director of the Vatican Library or Vatican Observatory is Father Jose Gabriel Funes, Jesuit priest, and he issued a press statement at the Vatican press office after this conference, saying, "The question as to whether intelligent extraterrestrial life exists elsewhere in our universe raises many profound and important philosophical and theological questions, and the time has now arrived at which these important questions must now be given serious consideration." And they recommended that the lay people and the scientists of the world start to engage in this discussion of these philosophical and theological questions. And they went on to have others who were participating in the conference make statements. And one of them was Professor Christopher Impey, a professor of astronomy at the University of Arizona's Stewart Observatory in Tucson. This is a sister observatory to the Pontifical Observatory. They exchange scientists and work at each other's centers. And Professor Impey said the following: the discovery of intelligent extraterrestrial life elsewhere in our universe is probably only a few short years away. If and when we make direct contact with such an intelligent life elsewhere in the vastness of space, the implications for our human self-image is going to be profound. It is therefore appropriate that a conference on this frontier topic be hosted by the Pontifical Academy of Science. For both science and religion posit life to be a very special outcome in this vast and generally inhospitable universe. There is therefore very rich ground for dialogue between the practitioners of astronomy, astrobiology, and other fields of science with the laity to understand the meaning of our existence in our universe. So this is the context in which we gather here today to start to participate in this philosophical and theological discussion. Now, a lot of people about all kinds of things, whether it's politics or Middle Eastern affairs or South American affairs or philosophy or astronomy, most lay people don't feel qualified to engage in these kind of discussions with experts because we've been taught to believe through primarily our major public education systems that they know and we don't. And so therefore, we have to kind of yield to them and let them tell us what reality really is. And even worse, sometimes we depend upon the major news media to communicate to us what is true. And now a number of the channels, the cable channels, whether the Discovery Channel, the History Channel, and other places. And so what we want to be doing is we want to be taking back responsibility for this important set of discussions that have been recommended that we all engage in now. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to share with you the specific kind of details that you need and that are if properly presented and discussed, you can retain this information and you can have it available for you to begin these conversations. And because what I really want to be able to do is to basically, as I'd indicated earlier in some of my talks, is to recruit you to be ambassadors, diplomatic ambassadors, to reach out to the extraterrestrial civilization, to individual members of it that might choose to engage in communications with you, and to utilizing this information, or until you start getting any information like that directly from them, to replicate a process that began back in 1874 with the National Board of Homeland Ministries of the National Methodist Church here in the United States. When confronted in the 1870s and early 1880s by this rising robber baron class of people in the United States that began to monopolize the major resources, the petroleum, the coal, the foodstuffs, the agricultural processes, the shipping companies, the railway companies, the steel production, and key aspects of our American economy, North American economy. The people started to become growingly distressed at the type of practices that these robber barons engaged in, such as having 7 and 8-year-old children working in the mines 12 to 16 hours a day because they were smaller and they could get into smaller places to place dynamite charges, etc. The children were being killed, in detonations and accidents, by the dozens, at least every year. And they just continued, the owners of these companies, these new corporations, that they had designed and created at the end of the American Civil War to immunize the owners of the actual companies from any liability whatsoever, because they simply owned stock, shares in the corporation. And therefore they were immunized against being held personally liable for any of the policies of those corporations. And the actual management of the corporations remained also immunized. That the only legal cause of action that would be recognized against these state-created, state-authorized corporations was a cause of action against the assets of that corporation. And then, of course, the lawyers moved in and started figuring out how to identify smaller and smaller pools of resources that were actually available to those corporations in the event they were sued. So they began to isolate out smaller and smaller amounts of money that could actually be gotten at by anybody who litigated against these corporations. And so that policy of this new business model that had been developed by the entrepreneurial class, the capitalists actually at the end of the Civil War, began to result in corporate policies that were engaged in ravaging the resources, because the more of the natural resources they could gather and take into their custody and put through the capital machinery that they financed and paid for, they could build more and more products and make more and more profit, and could share the profits every year with the stockholders, who remained immunized against any personal liability. And so because of the public policy problem that was generated by this new corporate model and these robber barons and their policies, the National Board of Homeland Ministry of the National Methodist Church decided they were going to, I mentioned this in one of the earlier talks, they were going to invite to come for the summer up to their Chautauqua summer place that they had, a big summer resort actually on Lake Chautauqua in northern New York up by Buffalo. They were going to invite the people who were going to be Methodist Sunday school teachers during the course of the year to come with their families and spend the summer for free at the Chautauqua up in northern New York, where they would have classes each day during the summer, as we're entering into basically now. The end of the school year would come, and so that then they'd be able to come to the Chautauqua with their families, and their kids could play and stay at the little resort and swim and do those things, crafts. We all remember that. And then, but the parents could be going to these classes. So it was conceived of as a way, an initial education to try to educate the Sunday school teachers about how to address the conduct of these major corporations and these robber barons, because it was viewed as being so contrary, their practices, so contrary to the basic Judeo-Christian social ethics that had been developed over thousands of years in the Jewish and Christian traditions. So that's how the process began. And then, as I mentioned earlier, after 4 years of this, in 1788, they actually decided that it was going too slowly, their project, and so they wanted to reach out to all of the social studies teachers in the schools, the junior high schools and high schools around the country, and so that they invited them to come up to the Chautauqua in 1788. And as I mentioned, thousands of high school social studies teachers came to the Chautauqua and kind of overwhelmed its resources. And they didn't have housing for them, they didn't have enough food for them, et cetera. And so a whole process began in the community up in northern New York, where people began to send food to the Chautauqua and to bring the food, and deliver it to these people. And an entire kind of communitarian phenomenon actually was generated around the Chautauqua movement that became actually, then it started raining on in the summer, and people lived in these tents, and the water would come into the tents, and so that people would all rush in and help them. And so that what it did is it actually was, as I mentioned a couple days ago, it was the Woodstock event of that progressive generation of the 20th century. They were the people that were being trained to come into their maturity in the 20th century after 18. This is all 1874 to 1878, and this is coming on into that penultimate year of 1898 when William McKinley was voted to be president, and Mark Hanna, who was his political advisor, was the guy that was in charge of the policies of the administration. And Mark Hanna, when he was asked what the highest possible aspiration a human being could have, his reply is to make as much money as possible before you die. And this was the ethos that was basically governing that entire period. And the Chautauqua movement rose up during that period from 1878 up into 1898, over a 20-year period. And we now, those of us who have reached the age of 49, realize that kind of a 20-year span is not as huge as we once thought it was when we were only in our teenage years. And so that in just that 20-year period, there actually rose into the ascendancy so many of these Chautauquas that were being done all around the country, because they couldn't handle the number of people at the Chautauqua, so they had regional Chautauquas. And the same thing happened in 1789 or 1879 rather, that they were overwhelmed, each of the 4 regional Chautauquas with social studies teachers, and then they started having them on smaller and smaller groupings until by the year 1920, there were actually 2,500 Chautauquas held during the summers. And this Chautauqua movement generated the American labor movement. The actual creation of labor unions came out of the Chautauqua. The feminist movement originated in the Chautauqua sessions. Susan B. Anthony used to come and be speaking at the Chautauquas, and it generated the whole suffragette movement, so that by 1919, they got the 19th Amendment passed so women could actually vote. And they opposed the child labor. They imposed child labor laws restricting the employment of young children in these dangerous situations. And they also initiated the initial environmental movement, demanding that certain whole areas of the country be set aside as protected zones. And they also began the post-Civil War civil rights movement, recognizing that the Civil War reforms were not being adhered to by many of the states, both in the South and in the North. And so they began the post-Civil War civil rights movement. All occurred out of the Chautauqua. And that whole operation was attempting to elucidate a set of ethical principles, a particular mode of ethical reasoning that was rooted in the values that had been identified by the Judeo-Christian social culture, to identify those as being contravened by the activities of these major new corporations and these robber barons. And that process went on all the way into when the First World War occurred. And at the end of the First World War, you remember, and I touched on this earlier, I'm just setting the context for us here, that the Bolshevik Revolution occurred in Russia, and they rose up and ousted the Tsar Nicholas, and ousted them from power after 1,000 years of czars, the royalists being in charge in Russia. They ousted them, and a revolution took place in which they were attempting to have the people take control of the resources and things in Russia. And the Bolsheviks formulated a theory that we're going to be talking about today, which through Marx and Lenin actually countered and confronted in an explicitly dialectical, confrontational manner the mode of ethical reasoning that was motivating these robber barons that had become rooted in a nation-state-based, Caucasian, state capitalist mode of ethical reasoning, that the tools of the state should actually be put at the disposal of these corporations so that they would mount foreign military expeditionary forces, for example, into Nicaragua, into Panama, into other areas to secure access to the resources for these major corporations. in that the owners of the shares of stock in these corporations were sitting together, for example, as investment clients in a private firm called Brown Brothers, which was a major private investment firm, and J.P. Morgan of J.P. Morgan Guarantee Trust, E.H. Harriman that owned the major rail lines, John D. Rockefeller that owned Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of California. They were all private investment partners in this Brown Brothers Harriman organization, and that they were actually coordinating policy together. That they would sit on the boards of directors of each other's companies so that they could come together and sit in these sessions together to coordinate their taking over all of the resources in some sort of a semi-cooperative way with each other. And that it was over that period of time from 1878 onwards that the Chautauqua movement was attempting to raise up consciousness among our people and have discussions like this in groups of 20, 30 people would come together to actually discuss how their policies were contrary to the basic Judeo-Christian social ethics. But the problem is that the Bolsheviks in 1917 to 1920, they actually formulated a directly counter-punctual kind of thesis, an operating thesis to the state capitalists in the Western civilization. And they set up, instead of a nation-state-based Caucasian state capitalist model that generated imperialism on behalf of their activity, getting military units of the American government to go in and seize and control resources in different parts of the world for them. The Bolsheviks set up what they purported to be a non-single nation state-based, worldwide communitarian or communist movement. The fundamental problem with that was that it was self-consciously atheistic. That, again, as I touched upon the other day, that they recognized that the Roman Catholic Church had been wedded to the Roman state ever since the 3rd century A.D., that when the emperor basically declared the Roman Catholic Church to be the state religion of Rome, and that the Roman Catholic Church had served from the 3rd century A.D. on all the way through the Middle Ages as basically the operational legate of the Roman Empire, and that whole tradition had so offended the revolutionaries in Russia that they basically condemned all religion in all the spiritual practices, denied the bona fides of them. That the famous quote that you know that Marx actually set forth is that the religions were the opiate of the masses, that they were designed intentionally to obfuscate the imperialist activities of the state of Rome and other nation states, and that they worked hand in glove with the royalists that were this elite that felt that they were uniquely authorized to make policy and own and run everything in their nation states. So that challenge that was put down by the Bolsheviks between 1917 and 1920 actually sucked basically all of the oxygen out of the previous Chautauqua movement that was attempting to deal with these policies that were contrary to a long history of thousands of years of Judeo-Christian social ethics. And they instead ended up being confronted by the purely secular, class-based, confrontational, dialectical energy of the world communist movement. And that dynamic, that dialectical, confrontational dynamic remained in effect from 1920 all the way through to December 31st of 1991, when the Soviet Union voluntarily dissolved itself. And what happened is that, and what we're dealing with now, is that the same economic and corporate forces that have been engaged in that long 80-year struggle, dialectical struggle with the communitarian communists, whose movement had degenerated fairly quickly into a Russian or Soviet Union nation-state-based mutual kind of imperialistic venture. And so what happened is that when that came to an end on December 31st, 1991, as I mentioned to you, the leadership working with the George H.W. Bush administration at that time, the Secretary of Defense, Richard Cheney, and his chief deputy, Paul Wolfowitz, called into the West Wing of the White House on the Monday morning following the dissolution of the Soviet Union on December 31st of 1991. They gathered together in the West Wing, and they actually drafted up a 1992 United States Defense Department policy planning guidance document that called for not the decrease of the American military budget in light of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but the increase in the military budget so that they could develop the military capacity to project U.S. military power throughout the world to establish full spectrum dominance, as they referred to it. And so what we have seen happening since that Monday morning following the dissolution of the Soviet Union is this ever-increasing kind of self-conscious embracing once again of that same ethos of the robber baron group in the United States and the corporations that they own, and they began to move in again to dominate and control the policies of the American government, even under the point now of getting corporate lawyers for those corporations all appointed to the federal judgeships throughout the federal system that are all members of a particular coordinated group called the Federalist Society. And just in brief, the Federalist Society comes from the initial Federalist Party that immediately after the creation of the United States Constitution, Alexander Hamilton and John Adams and a number of others who, in Alexander Hamilton, was literally the lawyer for the bankers and the mercantilists, that he literally served as their lawyer, and they organized this whole Federalist Party to attempt to set up a central bank and to set up special privileges for the corporation, for the gathering of business people into kind of growingly tightly coordinated kind of groups that had preceded the corporation. But that this problem existed right from the very founding of our country, that there was this whole group of extremely reactionary, indeed royalist sympathizers who wanted to have a tiny elite make the governing decisions for the United States government. And on the other side of that dynamic were the Jeffersonians and the Madisonians, and James Madison and Aaron Burr, who, as you may remember in the back of your mind, ended up killing Alexander Hamilton in a duel. So this debate has been going on for some time. But the bottom line is that what we're facing right now at the end of the Cold War, which we were also happy about. I mean, oh, wow, look, we've actually gotten out of this 80-year confrontation without having ourselves totally thermonuclearly destroyed, in that famous attack that we were all trained to get ready for by getting under our desks at school. So that this period of history that we're in right now was really initiated with the dissolution of the Soviet Union on that night of December 31st of 1991. So we're just into this new era where the previous forces that were organized as the robber barons have kind of congealed and have started to mount a major self-conscious campaign to eliminate all the restrictions that were placed upon them after the collapse of the economy in 1929, in the major depression, and Franklin Roosevelt coming in and setting up all the restrictions on the banks and the policies of the stock exchange and all of those things that they moved in under Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush and began to self-consciously disassemble those types of safeguards that had been imposed upon the corporations by the New Deal of the Roosevelt administrations. And so that's what we're really experiencing right now. And the reason that I raise this is because now that we're being called upon by the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church and the director of the observatory, of the Pontifical Observatory, and calling out to people to start to prepare ourselves to answer ourselves the philosophical and theological questions that are raised by contact with an extraterrestrial civilization, that it raises these fundamental questions of, well, what is philosophy all about? And what does philosophy have to do with trying to confront these robber barons? And how does all of that relate conceivably to the issue of extraterrestrial intelligence? And the reason that it relates to this in this rather unique subject that we've come together this weekend to talk about is because everyone recognizes that, in fact, as soon as it's acknowledged by the authorities of our human family that extraterrestrial intelligence exists, we are going to perceive ourselves as having been removed from the apex of all biological evolution. And we're going to, once again, be challenged that perhaps the entire experience of the universe may not be designed solely for us. That because one of the premises of the original worldview of the Roman Catholic Church that was so challenged by Copernicus, a Catholic priest, an observer, Galileo, and other one, and Giordano Bruno, another Dominican Catholic priest, that all of these people that were attempting to assert that the earth was not at the center of the universe, as the Catholic Christology had developed it, so as to reassure us of the central place that we played as a species in the unfolding of the universe and the moral purpose of the universe, was somehow fundamentally challenged if you tried to remove the earth from the physical center of the universe. And so that was what caused the recoil within the Catholic Christology to challenge those people. But the challenge, it's important to remember, the challenge to the very concept of a geocentric universe was undertaken by the priests that were running the observatories and saying that this isn't true. And so what happened is, once it was firmly established that it was scientifically proven that the earth was not the center of the physical universe, that what happened is that the church rushed right back in and replaced the kind of geocentric physical explanation of the universe by designing a pyramid pursuant to which we as the human family found ourselves at the apex of all of biological evolution. So once again, there we were. We were reestablished as the central process by means of which consciousness is opening onto having a relationship with the infinite and eternal. And that the universe was in fact created by Yahweh God as the matrix within which we as the human family were playing out this great cosmic drama of our being able to evolve up into our consciousness, of being able to have a direct relationship with the infinite and eternal. So the challenge that we are facing now is the fact that that pyramid is getting ready to be destroyed as a viable model of the respective place in which we as the human family find ourselves, that we are going to suddenly realize that we are not the only sentient, intelligent species in the universe. Indeed, it may be possible, indeed probable, that there are many civilizations that are tens of thousands of years, millions of years, conceivably billions of years, in advance of our civilization and our species, both intellectually and with regard to any of the other faculties that are subject to actual biological progressive evolution. And so that you can understand the scope and scale of the nature of the challenge that this presents to our human family. And so that this dialogue, this process, that ideally would be analogous to the discussions that were going on with the Chautauqua movement back from 1788 to 1900 into 1920 with the Chautauquas, needs to be reestablished, needs to be rekindled. Now that the Soviet Bolsheviks have stepped aside from having this confrontational dialectic with the capitalist class, what we can do is we can revisit that process, that dialogical process of the Chautauqua movement, and actually do so in the context of addressing, identifying, and answering these fundamental philosophical and theological questions about the nature of our species, about our place in the universe, the nature of the universe itself. And so what I wanted to do this morning, because of the audacity of some of the recommendations that I've made during the course of this week, I wanted us all to be able to have kind of an intensive seminar course on getting prepared for calling together your friends and neighbors and starting to have this discussion, okay? And so that what I wanted to do is I wanted to, first of all, I wanted to be able to make available to you the opportunity that I have to studying about these particular things at Harvard University with some of the tops in the field of dealing not only with philosophy and metaphysics themselves and physics and sociology and philosophy, etc., to carry on some of these conversations such as I did, and I want to share that with you. And I'll just, in closing these opening remarks, I just want to point out that I came to this discussion basically kind of kicking and screaming because I, after graduating from the law school, was out practicing and had done a number of those cases that I told you about. But particularly, I had been invited when I was one of the 3 criminal defense attorneys in F. Lee Bailey's criminal defense firm in Boston in May of, or actually early April of 1973. I was contacted and asked to become legal counsel for the American Civil Liberties Union, their amicus counsel, with regard to the Wounded Knee occupations that were going on out in South Dakota. That the person who was legal counsel for ACLU for the 10 states, mountain region of the country, had not. He was a very dear friend of mine from Harvard Law School, but he'd never done any litigation. And I'd been doing trials ever since I got out of law school, and was now at Bailey's office doing them. And so he asked if I would come in and actually come to the site where the occupation was going on, to be a legal advisor for ACLU as to what type of briefs to file with the law and the FBI and others to try to be of some assistance. So I ended up at the Wounded Knee occupation in 1973, amicus counsel for ACLU to the American Indian Movement, and ended up representing Russell Means and Dennis Banks and the Bellacourts, the ones that were allegedly responsible for organizing the occupation when they were prosecuted by the Nixon administration for crossing state lines to aid and abet a civil disturbance. And so the bottom line is when I came back from my first 10 days, 2 weeks there on site, I came back to the office at Lee Bailey's office, and Lee called me in. And he said, Danny, he said, I understand that you just spent the last 10 days or so out at the Wounded Knee occupation. I said, yes, that is true. And he said to me, he said, which side were you on? And I said, well, actually, I said, I was trying to keep the FBI from killing the people with snipers that were actually inside the compound, and also to try to keep the people from inside the compound from shooting the sharpshooters that were shooting at them. I said I thought it was a better idea to get medical supplies into them and food and water and try to get this thing calmed down and negotiated. And he said, and Lee Bailey said to me, what the hell good does that do us? He said, if you'd been on the side of the Justice Department in the Nixon administration, at least then I could send you in, because you had goodwill with those people, I could send you in and help negotiate perhaps, for example, a better deal for the Angiulo brothers, which is the mob family in northern Boston that he happened to represent. And just in brief, to give you some idea about the Angiulo brothers, the first encounter that I had with them is that this older man who owned a little mom and pop grocery store in the north end of Boston, you know, the 2 big goons come in on a Friday afternoon and offer to sell him Angiulo brothers fire insurance. And he said, I don't need that. I have fire insurance. And they said, well, you don't have the kind of fire insurance that'll make sure your place isn't burnt down next Friday afternoon, you know. And he said, he rolled up his sleeve and he showed them the numbers tattooed on his arm. And he said, you see these numbers? I got those at Auschwitz. He said, so I'm not afraid of you bastards, he said. And so he told him to get out of his shop. And that within a week, the Angiulo brothers had found out that he had one daughter who was married and was 8 months pregnant. And they tracked her and followed her on the Massachusetts Turnpike, chased her until she ran off into a rest stop and tried to make an emergency call at a telephone booth, and shotgunned her through the glass, killed her, and it was a horrible crime. And the Massachusetts State Police and the Highway Patrol that had jurisdiction on the highways all began an immediate, intense investigation. And they went and they talked with her father, who told them about this incident from the week before. And so they all realized that it was probably the Angiulo brothers that did this. And so the heat was on, intense heat. State police were after them, the Boston police. And so what happened is that within a week, the actual shooter that had killed her was driven past the very site where she was killed at 100 miles an hour in a car, and dumped out of the car and bounced down the highway to basically make an offering back to the police. Look, here's the guy that did it. We're giving him up. And they bounced him down the highway, and he was lying on the side of the highway dying when a Massachusetts State Police Turnpike police officer came upon him, recognized who he was, and said, "Look, Joe, you're dying. You aren't going to make this. You just tell me who it is that ordered you to do this killing. We know what this is all about here. We can tell from the symbology of this. Tell me who ordered this, and I swear to God, I'll get him for you." And the guy, with his dying breath, tells him that it was Michael Angiulo that had ordered the killing. And unfortunately for him, he survived. And they got into the hospital, and they operated on him, and he lived. And now he was going to be confronted as being a major witness against Michael Angiulo. And so I'm sitting in the office, and Lee Bailey calls me on the phone and says, "Come on into his office." So I come into the office. There's Al Johnson and Bad Andy Tooney, his big chief of investigators. They're sitting in the office, and they're saying, "Look, did you see the front page of the Boston Globe today?" And I said, yes, I saw that. And he said, "We're expecting a call from Michael Angiulo anytime to represent him and defend him." And I said, "Are you really?" And he said, "So, I wanted to have you in here when this happens." And in comes his secretary and says, "Mr. Bailey," said, "it's a telephone call from Michael Angiulo." And so he goes like this. He goes, and he picks up the telephone and goes, "Hey, Mikey." "Yeah, right. Oh, gee, Mikey, yeah. Shit, I saw that. I saw that. No, that is, oh, gee, no, that's terrible. Yeah, you're right. No, we'd be open to doing that. We'd be open to representing you, and that'll be $1 million in cash up front." Then he waits a little bit, and he says, "And another $1 million for our investigators." "Oh, really? Well, Mikey, fuck you too." Yeah, and he slams the phone down like that, right? And then he gets up and he says, $50. $50. He calls back within 5 minutes. And he reaches in takes out his wallet, puts a $50 bill on the table, and he says, "Who wants a piece of this?" And so Al Johnson says, "I'll take a piece of that." And then Bad Andy Tooney says, "I'll put 50 on that." And they turned to me and said, "Danny, are you in on this?" And I said to myself, "What the fuck am I doing here in this room with people like this?" And so that when I said to him, I actually said to Mikey Angiulo 3 or 4 days later when he was in the office, they came in trying to talk me into helping on this thing, and he came over to I was sitting at the desk, and Lee brings in Mikey Angiulo, and he walks in and he says, "Danny," he says, "Mikey Angiulo here." And I was sitting there, and I looked up at him, and there's Mikey Angiulo sitting there with his hands stuck out like this, and I said, "Great, yeah, I know who he is." And he was just standing there with his hands sticking out like that. And he said, "Mikey Angiulo." And I said, "Yes, I told you, I know who he is." And Mikey Angiulo looked at me kind of strangely like this, and I said, "Look, I told you before, and I'll say it again right in his face. I wouldn't piss on Mikey Angiulo if he was on fire." And Mikey Angiulo was standing there staring at me, and then he bursts out laughing. And he says, this kid's got balls, that's for sure, he says, right? And so I said, I said, the fact of the matter is that I understand that you guys have a kind of code, and I don't want you for a second to think that I support you in any way whatsoever, so you'll never think that I betrayed you. You know, I said, I wouldn't put pencil to paper to help you on this thing. And Bailey was horrified, and Julie just kept laughing until they left the room. And so when Bailey later said to me, if you'd been on the side of the Justice Department, we could have earned some goodwill, and you could have helped, get a better sentence for, like, the Angiulo brothers. I was saying, man, are we on different planets here? And so I tried to have a discussion with him about, what the purposes are of being a lawyer, the concepts of justice that we are supposed to be supporting, and why would you do things like this? And it was like just literally two ships just passing in the night. And so I was a little disturbed about this debate that we'd had on this Friday afternoon. So I was staying at Bailey's townhouse on Beacon Hill. And he lived outside with his wife, Linda, his new wife. And so I was staying there at the place. And so Sunday morning, I ended up going to Mass at St. Cecilia's Church. And I was on the way home after Mass, and I was kind of bumping along, and I stopped at a bookstore, what I would want to do on some Sunday afternoons, and was kind of leafing through the books. And I came upon this book called A Theory of Justice. And it had just been written by John Rawls, who was the chairman of the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University. And he had decided he was going to be writing a major book on what the theory of justice is, what are the underlying concepts that support the concept of justice in Western culture. And he was convinced at the start that what he was going to discover is that the basic mode of ethical reasoning that underlay the theory of justice in Western civilization would almost certainly be what he called the majoritarian utilitarian mode of ethical reasoning. And that is that if our community is confronted by a given public policy question here in a democratic republic, that it's likely that the resolution of that social crisis would in fact be predicated upon selecting the response to that public policy problem which generated the greatest good for the greatest number. Simple, classic utilitarian mode of ethical reasoning, rooted in a majoritarian democracy, so that all they had to do is figure out what was going to benefit the majority of people to the maximum degree and select that particular option. And it seemed perfectly logical to him that that's what he would discover. But much to his surprise, he said, he had discovered that there was something else operating. That he said, because if that were the principle that was still operating here in the United States, then why don't the 90% of the people who are white still own the 10% of the people that are black? Because that makes perfect sense from a strictly majoritarian self-interest point of view, a utilitarian point of view. And he discovered, he said, that there was operating inside the Western culture a completely different worldview. And that is the worldview of what he referred to as the intuitionists. There was this other group of intuitionists who would say things like, all men are created equal, they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that they have the right to the pursuit of happiness, and they start elucidating all these series of these fundamental rights that individuals somehow possess by their very human nature. The right to worship as they please, to hold whatever theological views they wish, speak freely, gather together publicly, petition their government for redress of grievances. There's this whole panoply of these kind of natural law rights that these people keep espousing. And it turns out that they'd been espousing them ever since the founding of the Constitution. And James Madison and these others in Jefferson had been making these comments. And it turned out that James Madison and Aaron Burr and three of the first United States Supreme Court justices in the country, 39 members of the House of Representatives, 22 members of the United States Senate, the first Congress. All of these people had all been students of Reverend John Witherspoon at Princeton University, which was at the time College of New Jersey. And they had all studied moral philosophy with this same professor. And that these people had come together and gathered together in the founding of the Constitution and had infused the American Constitution with this kind of thoroughgoing concept of natural law. That there were natural law rights that obtained with regard to every single individual over and against the state, over and against the majoritarian collective, who might make determinations based upon their own collective majority self-interest, and that these rights existed over and against any claim that the majority had to attempting to invade the life of a given individual and order them by threat of violence, ultimately, to comport with the majority's desires. And so there's this whole reservation of these rights that protects the individuals. In fact, it turns out that it wasn't just a reservation of rights of the individuals vis-a-vis the state. The very state that was created by the people was devoid of any authority whatsoever to engage in legislation or policies that violated these rights. That the rights existed in the affirmative, and the state existed completely conditionally. They didn't have that authority. So it's not a matter of the burden being on us to assert and prove our rights. If they're going to engage, the state is going to collectively engage in any type of action that attempts to coerce and restrict the absolute freedom of any given individual, the burden is on them. Not only the burden of going forward to suggest that they have the authority to do it, but the burden of persuasion that they actually possess such authority. And they can only go to the Constitution to see if it's there. So when I'm representing the New York Times in the Pentagon Papers, and I get the call from Jim Goodell, who is chief counsel for the New York Times, and he calls me at like 7:30 in the morning, and I'd gotten to know him. I'd gotten to know him because I was writing the amicus briefs. In the case that was to establish the right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources, because I had begun that case when I was a second-year law student at Harvard, and it actually asserted this right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources. And the case had gone on behalf of an NBC television reporter, John Pappas, and the case had gone all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And I was a second-year law student. And so Pappas wouldn't allow anybody else to represent him because nobody else understood this right. And so I ended up getting recruited by the #1 corporate law firm in the world, Cahill Gordon, Sonnet, Reindel, and Ohl on Wall Street, who were legal counsel for NBC. And so they brought me in so that they could retain custody of this case in front of the United States Supreme Court. So I was there doing the amicus briefs in writing not only the briefs in principle for NBC and for John Pappas, but also writing the amicus briefs for ABC and CBS and the New York Times and the Washington Post, etc. I was 25 years old at that time. And so that I was engaged in that process. And because of that, I got to know Jim Goodell, who was chief counsel, general counsel, and vice president for the New York Times. So when I received a telephone call from Jim Goodell this one early morning, I remember Monday morning following Easter back in 1971, I ended up getting the call from him, and he wanted to come over and meet with me right away, like at 7:30 in the morning. And I said, well, when do you want to be here? He says, as soon as I can get there. And I said, look, let me call Floyd Abrams, who's our partner that handles First Amendment stuff in our office, Gene Scheinman, his deputy from the Brooklyn Law Review, and bring them in. So he ends up coming into the office. He gets there about maybe 8:30 or so, and we dragged the other guys out of bed, and we got in there early. And so Jim Goodell comes in, and sits down and starts saying, aren't the walls straight up and down today? And, isn't the weather nice? And I'm saying, what's this up? I said, come on. I said, everybody just got up out of bed to come have this meeting. What's the story here? What's going on? So he gets up, he closes the door, and he comes and sits down and tells us that they've just come into possession of 47 volumes of the top secret internal Pentagon study about the war in Vietnam and all of their cable traffic and all the lies and all the deception that went on, the full knowledge that they had that it was violating the 1954 Geneva Accords by going in and supporting this total puppet regime that got set up by them. Anyway, it's just laying it all out. And so Jim Goodell says, he explains that their law firm had threatened to turn them into the FBI if they didn't turn the papers back over immediately. And so he was looking for a second opinion, needless to say. And so he explained what he did and what should we do about this. And so I said, I happened to be the one that said it, I said, print them. You know, you print them. I said, the only question you should really have is what the size of the typeface is going to be on the front page of the New York Times. And so bottom line is that he said, oh, really? He said, and he turns to me like this. No, he was actually sitting over here. I'm sitting over here, right? And Floyd is sitting behind the desk, and Gene Shyman's sitting over next to me. And he turns to me, and he says, really? He said, and Floyd Abrams literally jumps up from behind the desk and says, wait, that's not the opinion of the firm. We haven't discussed this with the executive committee. But Goodell is looking at me, and he actually picks his chair up and kind of sidles it over next to me. He said, really? He said, okay, so if we start to print these, what's going to happen? And I said, well, if we're lucky, I said that John Mitchell, who's the Attorney General for Richard Nixon, you know, who's a meathead bond lawyer, I said that given the fact that he probably thinks that the Constitution is a ship that sits in the harbor in Boston, is going to kind of instantaneously and reflexively threaten to prosecute you. And he said, prosecute us. And he said, for what? And I said, if we're lucky, espionage. And he said, espionage? And he picks up his chair and moves it back over to the other side of it, and he sits down. And I said, yes. And I said, but that's not good. That's good. I said, that's good because he doesn't know any better. And he said, know any better? And I said, yes. I said, U.S. v. Gorin. U.S. v. Gorin, I said to him. And he said, U.S. v. Gorin? And Floyd Abrams said, U.S. v. Gorin? And Gene Shyman said, U.S. v. Gorin? And I said, yes, U.S. v. Gorin. I said, that was that case back in 1944 where the young ensign at Pearl Harbor by the name of Gorin had given the sailing ship schedules for our warships and stuff to the British because he figured we were allies with them and they were coordinating their ships and stuff. And he was prosecuted under the Espionage Act for giving away national security secrets to a foreign government. And his lawyers asserted that, in fact, this whole theory of national security information was so vague and overbroad that you couldn't possibly prosecute someone for that without requiring that they had the adequate scienter, the specific evil intent of actually committing espionage against the government and turning it over to an enemy. And so that they actually won that argument in front of the Supreme Court, and that without them being able to allege that with regard to Gorin, they declared the statute to be otherwise unconstitutional on the face of it, as facially overbroad and vague. And so that condition precedent to any effective prosecution, criminal prosecution under the espionage statute, inherently carried with it the requirement to make this allegation. I said, they're never going to be able to make that allegation against you or Punch Sulzberger or Daniel Sheehan, who got the documents and stuff like this. So let's do it. And so we did. And so the bottom line, when we started publishing on June 13th of 1971, published the 13th, 14th, and the morning of the 15th. On the morning of the 15th, I get this telephone call about 8 o'clock in the morning. And the guy says, hello, Mr. Sheehan? I said, yes. He said, this is Whitney North Seymour. And I said, Whitney North Seymour? Whitney North Seymour? I said, am I supposed to know who you are? And he said, I'm the Whitney North Seymour. I'm the United States Attorney in New York. And I said, oh, right. I said, that Whitney North Seymour. And he was pissed off right from the very start. And he was calling and telling us that they were going to be going in front of Judge Murray Gurfein, United States District Court in Manhattan, Southern District, in asking for a restraining order, a temporary restraining order. He was asking me if we would voluntarily stop publishing these papers. And I said, absolutely not. He said, wait a second, you have to consult your client. I said, I don't have to consult my client. I said, I know perfectly well they're not going to stop publishing. And he said, well, what makes you think that? He said, because I'm going to tell them to not stop publishing. That's why. And so he said, I'm just calling you as a matter of courtesy. We're going to be going into Judge Murray Gerfine to try to get this temporary restraining order. I said, you mean a prior restraint on the New York Times? He said, well, I'm not here to argue about semantics. I said, no, it's just that's what it's been known as ever since the founding of the Constitution. That would be a prior restraint on the press. And they're totally devoid of any authority to issue anything like that. So he said, well, I just wanted to let you know that we're going to be coming in front of Judge Gerfine tomorrow at 1 o'clock, and as a courtesy, I needed to let you know that. And I said, well, we're awful busy over here. I said, we're involved in these papers being published. You probably heard about it. And he's just getting more and more angry. And he said, okay, he said, I just wanted to make sure that you knew that it was happening. I said, yeah, well, I don't know if we'll have time to be there, but I'll check with some of the other guys. And so I hung up on him. So the next day we go over to Murray Gerfine's chambers, right? And so we're in chambers, closed door session in there. And so I ended up finding myself here sitting with the New York Times, the number one law firm in the country, with Murray Gerfine, discussing whether or not the New York Times is going to be basically revealing that the entire United States military policy in Vietnam is totally criminally corrupt and that they knew it all the time. So what I'm saying is that I found myself in a situation where I have no problem whatsoever being able to determine what to do about a situation like that because of my understanding of the natural law history of this whole field. So the bottom line is that what I want to do is I wanted to share with you what had happened with me when I in fact found this book written by John Rawls because of my debate with F. Lee Bailey over the Wounded Knee case. And I was looking into it, and I saw this discussion that he had in there about these intuitionists and them postulating this natural law theory. And I said, oh, wow. I said, this is great. I said, what I had to do is I had to call him. What I'm going to do is so Monday morning, this was a Sunday, and I said that I read through the book, and I call on Monday morning, and I say, I talked to his secretary, and I basically said, this is Daniel Sheehan from Harvard College and Harvard Law School. I was kind of waving my school tie over the phone to see if she could know who I was, so that I wanted to see if I could get maybe 15 minutes with him to discuss his new book. And so she calls back a while later. She says, yes, he'll have 15 minutes. Come on over tomorrow. So I come over, and after 15 minutes, he calls up and cancels his appointment. We started talking. He canceled more appointments. So I was in there for 3 hours with him. He was completely flabbergasted that anybody who was involved in direct litigation like that would care anything at all about these kind of abstract discussions about the theory of justice. And so I ended up discussing this whole thing with him and asking him to explain this intuitionist school of thought in natural law theory. What was it that they actually believed that caused them to say things like that? And he was saying basically, gee, I don't know. He said, I kept trying to figure this out. What was causing him to say, because there wasn't any question in his mind that, of course, there is never has been any God. So this whole thing that somehow these are God-giving rights, that didn't mean anything to him. And so he didn't understand what it is they were saying. And the fact that there isn't any such God makes it even more difficult to figure out what it is they're saying, right? Because I had, obviously studied a lot of stuff about theology, and I knew that there wasn't any great white guy sitting in the sky with a big beard and, putting people in fire and all that. And so basically he ended up saying, well, why don't you come back to Harvard? Why don't you come back to Harvard and do a PhD comparing and contrasting this natural law worldview of the intuitionists to this majoritarian, utilitarian mode of ethical reasoning that he had thought was going to become the dominant governing theory of justice in Western culture. So I said I didn't want to stay at Bailey's anyway. And so the bottom line is, so I ended up agreeing to do this. And I come back over to Harvard University, and I enroll, and I get all ready to start going to classes. And then I realize that instead of being in the philosophy department, they've got me over at Harvard Divinity School. And then I started remembering all those times at Harvard Law School when I would ask a particular question of one of the law professors, and they would say, Mr. Sheehan, if you want to ask questions like that, you shouldn't be here at the law school. You should be over at the divinity school. And so I was kind of laughing to myself, well, here I am. I guess I'm over here at the divinity school. And the reason that I got put there is because Dr. Ralph Potter, who was teaching Christian social ethics, also taught the courses on comparative social ethics, comparing and contrasting different entire schools of theory with regard to ethics. And so, and Rawls knew that I should be writing the thesis under him. So I was there, and what I want to share with you, in preparation for your participating in these Chautauqua movement type discussions with your friends and neighbors, in fulfillment of this obligation, this responsibility that we have to actually prepare ourselves, not only to be able to answer the questions for our friends and neighbors and family, about what it is we're talking about here, these philosophical and theological implications of contact with an extraterrestrial civilization, but also to prepare ourselves for representing our human family in your discussions with the extraterrestrials, because I can assure you that we're not the best client that you might want to have in these discussions, but we are what we are. In the ability to understand why we do what we do, and why it is that some of our people do certain kind of things and others do other things. In order to have this intelligent conversation with extraterrestrial beings, you have to be prepared to basically think about these things, and you can do it. You've done this a lot, except that you may not have been given the tools to think thoroughly through these ideas. That was what my problem was. I found myself in these discussions with F. Lee Bailey, with the senior partners at Cahill, I found myself, surprisingly enough, without the type of intellectual, conceptual equipment to actually parse these issues adequately, splay them out before me, and kind of analyze them individually and interrelate the pieces of the information. I didn't know how to do that. And so this is what I was going to be able to find out how to do here. And so this sets the stage for us in preparing ourselves, thinking in terms of this being your first class in the Chautauqua movement to kind of rise back into the ascendancy now that the Soviet Union has gone away and this whole Bolshevik, secular, atheistic argument is no longer in the field, and we don't have to worry about being accused of being communist agents of the Soviet Union, simply because we know what the word capitalism means, which is exactly the standard they had set up. Anybody who talks about capitalism has to be a communist, because nobody else knows what it is, right? Basically, that's what they thought, that they're kind of standing there invisible in front of everybody. And the sad fact is that they were standing there invisible in front of everybody, because everybody was afraid to have the conversation, because they were afraid that, the John Birch Society or, McCarthy or somebody was going to drag you in front of a Senate hearing and put you in jail, And so that we're now free to have this type of conversation. And this is in the context of preparing yourself to actually convene some of these meetings, some of these Chautauqua meetings, to discuss this with your friends and neighbors. So this is what I discovered. The first startling thing that I discovered, and Dr. Ralph Potter was telling me this. He said that his mentor, Talcott Parsons was the chairman of the Department of Sociology at Harvard University for 22 years. And it was before Henry Reisman came on board and headed up the sociology department. And Talcott Parsons had undertaken a major inductive study of looking for a particular piece of information, of interviewing people in the United States, in North America, all about what their ideas were, how they thought as a sociologist, an interesting inquiry. And what he came to believe is that when, in fact, any given collective community is confronted by a particular public policy question, whether or not you're going to put in a collective sewage system, whether or not you're going to have a public school system, whether or not you're going to have build roads in your community. Whatever the public policy issue is that's presented to this community, that they're confronted with a series of alternative options that they can choose to address this public policy problem. And what Talcott Parsons discerned through all these tens of thousands of interviews that they did over a period of years is that when any given human family is confronted by a given public policy question, in his judgment, we would in fact divide ourselves into 5 different groupings, and that there would be on the extreme, and he designed this spectrum. Talcott Parsons is the guy that came up with this sociological spectrum. And what he discovered is that there would be one group of people in that community that he referred to as simply right systematists. That these people on the right side of his spectrum were systematic thinkers that would go through things very thoroughly and think things through thoroughly, and they would come up with a particular set of proposals. And there was, I guess you would say not surprisingly, that he discovered that there was another group of people who in fact were left systematists that would come up with a completely different set of proposals as to what to do about this given public policy problem. And then he discovered that there was a group of people that he referred to as right marginalists. And that was the only term he used for them, that were somehow, he placed them sort of inside here in the spectrum from these right systematists. And similarly, there was a group that were left marginalists. And then he said that there was a group that he called middle marginalists. And this was his sociological bar graph on which he put people based upon the particular proposals that they would make in response to a given public policy problem. And what he said is that the interesting fact was it didn't make any difference what you told them or how many more facts you gave them or what kind of arguments basically that you made dealing with the specifics of the public policy problem. They would still stick with the same exact proposals that they were making, and that you couldn't budge them much. And so that you would get this kind of division within the community of these public policy options that should be exercised. I began to study this, and it became clear to me, at any rate, that he had left out 2 additional worldviews. This is what I was writing my master's thesis on at Harvard Divinity School, that there was a group that were actually left middle marginalists and right middle marginalists. And what I realized is that if you looked at these people and tried to figure out who they were, you would realize that these worldviews generated an authoritarian worldview at the extreme right end of this political spectrum. And that, in fact, just inside them were a group of reactionaries. And then there were conservatives, and there were moderates, and there were liberals, and there were progressives, and then there were the left systematists were utopianists. Okay? So here they are. Here's this discussion that you keep hearing. Well, this person's a liberal. That person's a conservative. Oh, this person's a neocon, a neoconservative. That's because they don't want to say reactionary. And they're neoliberals because they didn't want to say that they were just moderates and had abandoned the kind of liberal cause of the Democratic Party. So here they are. Here is the political spectrum that comes from authoritarians to reactionaries to conservatives to moderates to liberals to progressives to utopians. And therefore, this is what you're going to encounter, because it turns out that the response on the part of members of our human family, when confronted with the UFO experience and the whole issue of extraterrestrial intelligence and what the kind of public policy should be with regard to responding to this particular challenge, that you're going to discover that the position that is taken on the part of people in response to this challenge is completely determined by their worldview. It's not something that is a kind of a balanced, careful judgment. It's kind of an initial instinctive decision that they make, and then they spend their time rationalizing it after that. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to be able to help prepare you for this, because you're going to be encountering people all across the political spectrum in your discussions, and you're going to discover this exact thing, that they have this kind of almost instantaneous, knee-jerk, emotional, kind of unreflected upon reaction to the issue, and they stick with it. And you start showing them videotapes of the UFOs. They go, "Oh, those could be faked." You know, you could walk an extraterrestrial right in and sit them on their lap, and they say, "Oh, somebody's got a fake uniform on here." You know, they won't move on this. And it turns out that this is a generic problem with our human family, that we lock on to these positions. And so therefore, what he was saying is that in order to move a person from a position here, for example, to a position here, rather than focusing on the particulars of the public policy problem that you're discussing and trying to give them more details to try to convince a reactionary that somehow the Sandinistas are not satanic, you know, and they don't eat their children. If you're talking about the Nicaraguan crisis with regard to the Iran-Contra case, et cetera, you know, that you can give them more and more information and evidence, and they're still convinced that they're going to be coming in tanks, you know, up into southern Texas, and that you can't move them by just trying to give them more information. And the fact that they discovered that Catholic priests are, for example, their foreign minister, they just think the priest has been corrupted entirely because now he's supporting a satanic government. And so you can't give them any information that is contrary to their initial belief and have it mean anything. So what Talcott Parsons was saying is that you've got to try to get at what the underlying belief system is that causes these people to adhere in this kind of wooden way to these particular worldviews. And so this was the work that Dr. Ralph Potter had spent his time doing, and what he had discerned in doing all of this work is what he discovered is that what causes a person to adhere to one or another of these particular worldviews is that there are 4 fundamental fact questions that every single human being has to and will tend to, at least unconsciously, answer for herself or himself pertaining to ultimate reality itself. And so what Dr. Ralph Potter determined was that there were basically 4. This isn't working too well here. This happens a lot. That there are basically 4 fundamental fact questions that every human being has to answer for themselves and will do so, whether or not they have enough information to pass a test on it or not. And the first one is what he calls the cosmological question. That is, how did this material universe that we find ourselves in the midst of, how did this actually come into being? Has the physical universe always existed here? Did it come into being at one particular time? Was it kind of created in some way? How did all of this come to pass? And the basic fundamental question is, why is there all of this rather than nothing? What's going on here? How did this begin? And the second question is they call it, its fancy name is teleological question, and that is the physical universe, once it's here, is it unfolding in some particular way, some particular direction? Is there some particular systematic principle operating in the universe pursuant to which it is unfolding toward some particular end? some particular teleological end pursuant to some sort of a logical and observable progression of any kind. Because if in fact there is such a process, you might be able to then assume that there's some underlying principle or purpose to the universe, and that then of course you could try to figure out how to coordinate your conduct in accordance with that principle. But a fourth major question, and a big question, this is what they call the ontological question. And again, this is just another great big word for how did consciousness arise? If in fact the material universe is manifest in this material universe of all this non-conscious and non-sentient physical matter, like rocks and dirt and sand and water and oxygen and nitrogen, etc., how did that eventually generate consciousness? Each of us, more specifically, our consciousness. How did this happen? How did I get here? You know, how is it that I am, given a confluence of mass and energy, how is it that I've become sentient and self-conscious and self-reflective? Whatever triggered that process. So this ontological question is one that lies at the root of one's own experience, of one's own consciousness, once you begin to reflect upon that question. If you just stay rooted in your consciousness and be completely unreflecting, then basically you're wasting an entire intellect, you know. But given the fact that we do have this intellect and that we're able to distinguish the difference between ourself and the outside world, this is that question that Alan Watts talks about in the book, you know, that everybody has suspected that somewhere there's a book that tells this, that talks about this. And Watts has talked about that in this thing called The Book. And he's talking about, you know, here we are riding around up here behind our eyeballs, kind of looking out at the rest of the world, and so that there's a seat of consciousness that we have, that we discern as uniquely ourself, actually. And this ontological question is one that, even if you don't reflect a lot upon it, it still is very meaningful at the root of your sense of yourself. And there's a fourth and final question here that he said that we have to always, and it's called the epistemological question. Again, just a great big word for the question of what means do we have at our disposal as human beings to possibly answer cosmic questions like this? Are we restricted to our five senses of seeing and tasting, touching, feeling, etc., and processing the data that we can get from our five senses through our intellect into trying to kind of figure out what all of these disparate data that we encounter in our physical experience, we kind of organize those together pursuant to our intellect and come up with some kind of logical answer as to how we can answer these questions. So that these cosmological, teleological, ontological, and epistemological questions are the four fundamental pillar questions that any individual human being is going to ask herself or himself in attempting to orient yourself in order to be able to answer these big questions, right? This is what Dr. Ralph Potter, in all of his surveying of trying to figure out what the root issues were that undergirded a particular worldview, that these were the kind of thoroughgoing questions. And so in philosophy, the joke in the philosophical community is that the entire philosophical endeavor is an attempt to provide an epistemological answer to the ontological question. And that doesn't have to be meaningful to you at this stage, but the bottom line is that's the big joke that they make among themselves when they're all sitting around. But what Ralph Potter was saying is that in his investigation of Talcott Parsons' sociological bar graph, that he was discovering that the fact is that the reason that people are adherents to one or another of these different worldviews is because the fact is it is presently impossible for us as human beings to definitively answer any one of these questions. We don't have the proper data to answer any of these questions right now. And so what happens is we each make kind of an intuitive, unconscious decision about these fundamental questions, even if we don't do so consciously and discuss it with anybody. And that predicated upon what the answer is you provide to these questions, if in fact you answer each of the three other questions in a way that is internally and self-referentially consistent with the answer that you provide to any other one of them, if they're all internally and self-referentially consistent, the answers you provide, you in fact have a systematic worldview. Okay? And now the fact is, lots of people don't. People can entertain completely contradictory beliefs. Not the least of which you see the people down in Texas that are revolting against the federal government, and they're riding around carrying an American flag and saying things like, have the government keep their hands off my Social Security. You see? And so that you say, well, gee, that's like somebody put a screwdriver in his ear and kind of scrambled his brains up, and what's he talking about? So that like everybody can't sing on tune. Everybody doesn't have the trained ability to think systematically. And so that what they do is they have a garbled set of answers to these things. And then the point is that when you ask them to answer a particular question, they don't do it very coherently, and they aren't consistent in their answers to things, right? But there are people who are adequately disciplined that when they answer one of these questions, they answer the other questions in a way that is completely consistent with that other answer. And that therefore they end up being in one of these worldviews. So the question that immediately occurs, of course, to you is, what are the different beliefs that one can logically have? And why is it that there's only this spread of them? Why aren't there an infinite number of answers all along the spectrum? Well, the short answer is there are. There are all these little in-between places when you're not answering these questions consistently with each other. But when you do hit upon a consistent set of answers to them, that you fall along the spectrum in these key nodal points. Not entirely unlike the people who can, in fact, sing do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, and have it be the same all the time. I'm not one of those. But the fact is that in the same way that you have a spectrum of light where you have pure red light in orange and yellow and green and blue and violet and indigo, that all are perceivable by our particular sensory system, that it turns out that there is in fact a full octave as well of these beliefs. And so that, for example, you have the cosmological question. You ask the cosmological question of how the universe came into being, and you come here to the first right systematists, and they happen to have a belief, even though it's not able to be proven dispositively right now, but you hear all kinds of discussions like this going on, even in the newspapers. They'll say, well, what they believe is that the universe came into being by a big bang, that there was a big bang, and moving outward from that big bang, every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter was repelled and moved away from every other one. This wasn't just a simple explosion from the center out. It was a repulsion of every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the universe from every other one. And that's what lent to it this extraordinary power that it had at the beginning of the Big Bang. And they began to move out and away from each other, these particles. But at the same time, the instant after the Big Bang occurred, that the attraction of every one of these ultimately irreducible integers of matter for each other set in, and even though there was an intense impetus put upon them, blowing them out and away from each other, there was at the same time operating an attraction that they all had for each other. And this is that whole discussion of the attraction of matter for each other, that you go into a large gymnasium and you hang a gigantic wooden ball from the ceiling by a fine carborundum wire, and you go to the other side of the gymnasium and you lower a little wooden ball on a carborundum string and you let go of it, the little ball will move toward the big ball because they're attracted to each other. And not because they're metal, because they're not. You're dealing with wood. But the fact is, the big ball actually moves toward the little ball too, but it does so infinitesimally that you can't see it, basically. But this is the experiment that they have that causes us to understand that every ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe is attracted to every other one, and the degree of attraction is inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. That's one of those formulas we used to memorize in high school physics that we didn't know what the hell it meant. But that's what they're talking about. And so the bottom line is that they believe that this Big Bang occurred and that the pieces of it are all moving out and away from each other, but because of the attraction that they have at the same time, they begin to bond together and they start to form these inchoate quantum fields, start to form muons and leptons and electrons and protons and neutrons and atoms of elements, and then mixtures and compounds and planets and solar systems and galaxies and quadrants of the galaxy, and then octave areas of more density in the physical universe, until they've actually generated this entire physical universe, which is continuing to expand. Everything out and away from each other, and at the same time, every single element on the periodic tables, these 280 plus different distinct elements, are at all times disintegrating. They are all disintegrating from their present molecular or atomic structure. They are disintegrating at the particular rate of their atomic breakdown into the smaller constituent elements of which they're all made up. But it turns out they're all made up of the same thing. They're all made up of these little inchoate quantum fields and these leptons and muons and electrons, etc. And that what they believe is that this expansion is going to be continuing at the same time the disintegration is continuing, and that there's going to ultimately come a point where every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical cosmos is separate and apart from every other one. And at that point, they believe that the expansion is going to continue to the point where the universe will completely dissipate, and that there will be no thing, literally, no thing in the universe. The universe disintegrates into nothing. Okay? And that the reality is that this particular cosmological assumption, which you hear discussed all the time, is pretty pessimistic about the ultimate value of the universe, the ultimate purpose of the universe, because the teleology that they believe is this inevitable expansion and disintegration. That's the teleological assumption that they make. That is the process that is unfolding with the universe once it's come into existence, and that it therefore has a ultimately finite lifespan, and is going to disintegrate. And so therefore, there's no, and moreover, they believe that epistemologically, their epistemological belief is that the only means that we have at our disposal to try to answer these questions are our five senses. We have our five senses, and we have our intellect that we can process the data through, and that, and therefore, if you can't feel it, and you can't see it or touch it or taste it, that as far as they're concerned, operationally, it doesn't exist. And so what they do is they believe that the entire universe is chaos. That they look out at the universe, they stand out under the stars at night, and they look up and they see this kind of incredible array of matter everywhere, and they feel themselves, they experience themselves as being separate and apart from it, standing alone beneath the cosmos that is basically chaos. Huge, thriving nebulae pouring out stars, and it's just chaos, and it's disintegrating ultimately into nothingness. And so that they actually, what you discover is that if in fact, then that's their cosmological belief. And their ontological belief is that consciousness is in fact nothing more than a particular physiological phenomenon, indeed an epiphenomenon, of the interface between mass and energy. That the confluence of mass and energy that assembles at any given time some of them actually come together to generate as an epiphenomenon consciousness. That is kind of a biological, physiological byproduct of the simple random interaction between mass and energy that happens to occur. So that's their cosmological assumption, their teleological assumption, their ontological assumption of the epiphenomenon of consciousness, based upon the epistemological assumptions they have that all they have operating is their five senses and their intellect. And so that they end up, what you discover is that is what undergirds their pessimistic analysis of reality, and therefore they believe that since reality is chaos, the only option is to superimpose upon an otherwise chaotic universe the powerful will of a particular individual who can act consistently and aggressively and then superimpose meaning on an otherwise chaotic universe. And so what they do is they seek out an authoritarian or authoritative leader that can provide some kind of sense of order to chaos. Okay? And so that this generates an authoritarian or authoritative social norm for them. And so that to compare and contrast it, you move one step over in toward the center and you get to the reactionaries, which are a very important group that we'll talk about here today. The reactionaries, their cosmology is basically the same, that the universe began with a Big Bang, and it's moving out and away from the locus of the Big Bang. It's disintegrating. It's going to get to a point where every ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the universe is separate and apart from every other one. But at that point, they happen to have a cosmological belief that when they get to that point where every single integer is separate and apart from every other one, that the impetus initially imposed upon them by the Big Bang will expire. And that there'll be this microsecond where the universe stays in a state of stasis because there is an attraction among every single one of the particles for each other. And if the impetus of the outward momentum of the Big Bang is completely exhausted, it'll stay there in a state of stasis for a microsecond. And then the attraction will start to draw them back in upon each other again. And then they will reform into leptons and muons and electrons, in protons, in neutrons, in atoms, and mixtures and compounds and galaxies and planetary systems, etc. And that what happens is that'll all keep on happening, and this attraction drawing them all back into contact with each other will go on until such time as every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical cosmos is in direct physical contact with every other one. And the entire physical universe will be reduced to the size of the head of a pin. Now, you've only heard that 1,000 times, right? That's what their theory is that the whole universe existed at one point in the size of the head of a pin, and all the matter in the universe was condensed in that event. And what they then believe is that at that exact moment when they all are in direct physical contact with each other, the polarity immediately switches, and they all repel each other again. And so that the Big Bang is repeated again, and so that whole process goes on. And this particular cosmology is what they refer to as the oscillating cosmos. That it's oscillating constantly between a state of expansion, ultimate expansion, into a state of absolute energy, down into a state of absolute mass. And that it's just in some sort of a ratio to each other and during each of the stages of the process. They refer to this as the magnum annus. This is the great year. This is the maxima periodos, they refer to this as. This is the grand year, the process of the universe expanding and contracting. And that in the interim, during both the expansive phase and the condensing phase, there occur certain ratios of mass and energy to the point of generating consciousness. So that they start to hold a whole set of beliefs about the other belief systems that are supportive, that are derived from this cosmology. And so you say to yourself, well, wait a second, so here's these two over on this end. Well, what about over on this other end? You get these left systematists and left marginalists over here, and you get the right systematists and these right marginalists here, what is a differing cosmology that these people have here? And you get to the left systematists, and what they theorize is that in fact that the universe is actually, when you get out to the outer perimeters of the physical universe, the sum total of mass and energy that exists in the physical universe, out beyond that resides an infinite, and eternal sea of absolutely undifferentiated consciousness. And that this has always existed, always will exist. But in fact, that this infinite and eternal sea of undifferentiated consciousness has enfolded into being the material universe. That the material universe, these inchoate quantum fields that make up the universe, are in fact subparticles of consciousness. They're actually condensed consciousness. And that this condensed consciousness has started to move into form in the material universe, and it generates the entire confluence of mass and energy that is the universe. And that they have all kinds of discussions about this, and they refer to this infinite and eternal sea of undifferentiated consciousness as the one thing that is not a thing among other things. It's the Greek for it. But that in fact the physical universe is a direct function of this infinite and eternal sea of undifferentiated consciousness. And that therefore everything that's going on inside this is a subfunction of the original purpose for the infinite and eternal sea of undifferentiated consciousness enfolding into being the material universe. And so that they begin, what this does is this lends a particular teleology to the unfolding of this particular phenomenon, because there's some purpose assumed in the infinite and eternal sea of consciousness having done this. Because you would say to yourself, otherwise, why, if there's an infinite and eternal sea of completely undifferentiated consciousness just abiding, you need to understand, this is not a noun. We are not dealing here with a noun, because there's no material dimension to the infinite and eternal sea of undifferentiated consciousness. There's no boundaries. There's no noun. What this is a verb. Indeed, it's a non-transitive verb, for all of us remembering how to diagram our senses. It's a non-transitive verb of being, that there is no nounness to this. And in fact, the one overarching mistake that you can make with regard to this insight is to try to nounify this phenomenon. Because if you do, you are engaged in the ultimate sacrilege. You have nounified the infinite and eternal. That is why you can never name the infinite and eternal. Because by doing so, you immediately cross over into the ultimate mistake of nounifying this. And this is the great I am that I am. Okay? So what I'm saying is that you automatically see that because of the cosmological assumptions of these left systematists and the teleological assumptions of this, you begin to get a completely different worldview. The assumptions are completely different. Now, the one that we want to start talking about here today, which is extremely important, that this is the seventh paradigm worldview. The left marginalist worldview is a sixth paradigm worldview, which they refer to as the radical monist worldview. And what they do is they're talking about the fact that they're not the left marginalist worldview, the sixth paradigm worldview, is not postulating anything about the exterior reality to the physical cosmos. They're saying nothing about any infinite and eternal sea of consciousness. What they're doing is they're talking radically about the actual monad of the physical cosmos. That they believe that the cosmos is one unified, harmonious whole. And that this discussion began very early on in ancient Greece among the Greek Stoics. And what they were saying is that they were able to discern, actually, the Greek Stoics and the pre-Socratics, as they refer to them, before Socrates, they actually came up with an understanding that the entire physical universe was made up of atoms. That there were these little teeny, like billiard ball things that were the ultimately irreducible integer of matter. They didn't realize you could penetrate into the atom and break it down into eventually these inchoate quantum fields. But they believed that this cosmology, that they talked about their cosmology of being all inside this monad. Now, and what they began to discuss, there's a guy by the name of what was his name? Heraclides started talking about this, and there was a man by the name of Parmenides. Parmenides started talking about the fact that there was a practice that you could engage in as a human being that he referred to by the Greek term of hibernation. There is a hibernation process when you can sit in place and breathe like bears do in hibernation, or other animals. You could sit and you could breathe in this way, and you could in fact intuit that everything was unified, and that there was a unified phenomenon that bonded everything together. They began to talk about this as radical monism, and that the pre-Socratic Stoics had an extraordinarily sophisticated philosophy about this whole thing, because one of the things that has become clear, besides the fact that this doesn't erase very well, yes, yeah. If we could, oh, there we go. Thank you. That one of the things that the radical monists, the pre-Socratic Stoics and stuff, yeah, is there? Okay, yes. Let's just do that. Okay. There we go. Thank you so much. We can just do the top anyhow. Okay. Thank you. The bottom line is that they discovered that if in fact you answer the 4 pillar questions, the cosmological, the teleological, the ontological, and the epistemological, if you answer each of those questions in a way that is internally and self-referentially consistent with each other, you do so by having discerned a certain principle that is common to all of them. And that principle, if you discern it and give a consistent answer to all these things, what it does is it ends up generating a particular mode of ethical reasoning. It generates a mode of ethical reasoning because if you're confronted with the choice to make with regard to anything, you're going to unconsciously refer it to your reality. What do you think reality is? And therefore, you're going to be always making decisions that are at least unconsciously consistent with your understanding of reality. And so that the principle that you discern that is common to the answer to these 4 major pillar questions generates a specific mode of ethical reasoning. And for example, in the first paradigm worldview, if the world in the universe is chaos, and the only possible solution is superimposing upon an otherwise chaotic world, did I have some water? Here's the water. You superimpose upon the otherwise chaotic universe the will of one authoritarian person. If you're lucky, it's a person who's authoritative, as distinct from authoritarian, such as a great tribal princess or chieftain of your tribe, who is kind and compassionate and considerate of their people, and that they, in fact, are the ones that make the decisions, but they make them consistently and fairly, etc. There's such a thing as an authoritative leader that is distinct from an authoritarian leader. But the bottom line is that if in fact you believe that, the challenge with this one is that if you believe that the universe is ultimate chaos, that your mode of ethical reasoning usually ends up being, let's do whatever it is that feels the best immediately. Because the world is chaos, let's seek out immediate pleasure, avoid pain to the greatest extent to which you can, and so that there ends up being a kind of selfish mode of ethical reasoning. So when faced with a range of options of public policy choices, you select that one that generates the greatest amount of immediate pleasure to yourself or to your loved ones. And that you do that over and avoid pain in their entire systematic ethical systems that are rooted in this. Thomas Hobbes and others. It's this selfishness. It is in fact a hedonistic worldview of seeking a maximization of physical pleasure. Okay, and the same thing is true of a reactionary. A reactionary mode of ethical reasoning is that if in fact the thing that distinguishes the reactionaries, the reason that they in fact believe in an oscillating cosmos is because they have been able to somehow discern intuitively that this expanding process somehow then comes back together again. And so that they don't believe that there's chaos. They believe that there's a fundamentally bipolar, dialectical dynamic that is actually functioning at the base of all reality. And so that they have a sense of dualism, a dialectical, bipolar dynamic that is functioning in the universe. And so therefore, when they're faced with a set of range of options, what they do is they recognize that all they can discern that distinguishes this from chaos is this bipolar dialectical dynamic that's occurring in the universe. And so what they do, they choose a mode of ethical reasoning, is they believe that there is basically functioning in the universe at any given time two major attractor forces of the expansion and the bonding of the universe. And that what they do is they have these as the yin and the yang. This is the Tao. This is the famous Tao that you see, the great symbol of the unified circle with the two teardrops together. That this is the yin and the yang. There's always a thesis and an antithesis. What they say is that, look, if you cannot in fact discern exactly what everything is going on in the universe, you can really not discern truth. Kant was a major adherent to this. Kant insisted that each of us has no access to absolute truth. That all we can do is ascertain our own operating thesis about truth. And that therefore, since you don't have direct, perfect access to absolute reality, you postulate your own thesis as to reality. But someone is going to be postulating an anti-thesis. And because that too is inherently flawed and imperfect, that the two of you will confront each other in the thesis and the anti-thesis. And this will ultimately generate a synthesis. The better parts of each of the two different positions will remain. The others will be burnt off in conflict. And that it'll generate a synthesis, which will in fact become the new operating thesis, which will inevitably give rise to a new antithesis, which will in fact confront each other and generate a new synthesis. And so that there's this constant process of working one's way toward truth, but that you can never get there because there's no discerning absolute truth. But there is in fact a dialectical dynamic by means of which truth can be moved toward. And so therefore, the meaningful choice to make as your mode of ethical reasoning is to get yourself on one or another side of the two conflicting parties. And that this is a major root experience of the human family. There are all kinds of human beings who engage in this particular dialectical process. That you see it all the time. The good guys versus the bad guys. The good versus the bad. The black versus the white. The red team versus the blue team. You know, the Seattle Seahawks versus the New England Patriots. The Boston Red Sox versus the New York Yankees. You know, the Los Angeles Lakers, versus the Cleveland Cavaliers. And what they do is they foist this on you constantly as this kind of unconscious dynamic. And in fact, the great anthropologist, I'll think her name in a second. Anyway, she was doing a major set of studies. She had found a tribe. Margaret Mead had found this tribe down in Papua New Guinea back in the 1950s that had not had any contact with the outside world at all. And what they did is they set up these long-range telephoto cameras and stuff up on the cliffs to observe this tribe, and they lived in this valley. And it turns out that the tribe had actually, over time, divided itself into two different groups, and one of them lived upon this side of the valley wall, and the other one lived on the other side of the valley in these hills. And their hunting parties would go out down onto the floor of the valley, and they would engage in hunting until the two groups ended up eventually encountering each other. And whenever that happened, they would fight. And they would fight until one person had been killed. And the instant that one person was killed, they would withdraw. And they'd withdraw back to their respective sides of the valley. And the ones that in fact had lost the person who'd been killed would engage in this huge funeral dirge and carry the person around and throw ashes on themselves and moan and groan. And then the people on the other side of the valley would rejoice. They'd have this huge bacchanalia fest, and they would make this type of drink that they had and get intoxicated and light these big fires and dance around the fires and fuck their brains out. She said, "Oh, what's this?" There they are. They're having this huge orgastic ceremony, this big celebration, this big fertility rite, and they say, "Wow!" And here's these other people on the other side, pouring ashes on themselves. And she said, this was extraordinary that this tribe would do that. And then she discovered over time that they were taking turns, that they would alternate exactly every period. And they would exchange these things one time after another, of taking turns on getting to do this. And so that you saw functioning at the base, trying to give themselves a sense of meaning in this dialectic of sorrow and rejoicing. So this particular reactionary worldview is extraordinarily important because from Kant's original observations, that's right, from Kant's original observations that we can't get access to the truth, and there's this dialectical dynamic, it gave rise to Hegel. And Hegel, we need to understand, Hegel was present in Europe after the French Revolution that went on from 1789 to 1791, not coincidentally the exact same time that we here in North America were doing our revolution and had overthrown the royalists and the theocrats, and had actually put in a natural law system in our Constitution. What happened is the French Revolution failed, and the royalists came back into power, and they were saying, "Wow, was that close?" All these peasants rose up against us, and they were defying us. And what they were doing is they were actually asserting that the divine right of kings that had been developed by the Roman Catholic Church and the royalists together, the theologians